Welcome, Dr. Epic here, and what we're going to do in this lecture is begin our discussion of the institution of American slavery, trying to decide why it was created and exploring how it was created in the context of first colonial America and then in the United States of America. We're going to discuss why it really matters in the 21st century debates about this historical institution. And finally, we'll begin to explore how it developed and how it developed in colonial America and how it developed up to and then past the Revolutionary War. And there is the outline right up above me that you should write down and use that as a sort of table of contents for your notes. And let's go ahead and begin. First off, why does any of this matter? Why does a discussion of the 17th century construction of American slavery even matter? And it matters for these reasons, that the institution of American slavery largely defines early America, and the experience of American slavery was the single great moral sin of the early country. And it was a major contributing factor to the American Civil War, if it isn't the contributing factor to the American Civil War. It dominated the southern colonies, and then after the Revolution, the institution dominated the southern states. And the psychological damage and the social damage done from the institution of American slavery resonates to this very day. And it all goes back to this 17th century decision, this decision where the country decided to enslave a quarter of its own population. And this resonates in political debates to this day. And in the 21st century, there is a significant political movement that argues that African Americans, as the descendants of slaves, are owed reparations for the enslavement of their ancestors. There is Ta-Nehisi Coates right up above me in his very famous 2004 article in The Atlantic. There's the New York Times 1619 Project. And you have this political argument. The political argument is that the descendants of slaves are owed reparations for slavery. Now, the important thing to remember, though, is that these guys, whether it's the New York Times or Ta-Nehisi Coates or any of these characters, these guys are not historians. They are political actors with a political agenda. They're activists. They're not historians. And this causes an issue. This will cause an issue later on when we discuss these arguments. But within history itself, we are actually in the middle of a major historical row over the role that slavery played in the American economy, with some historians, like Edward Baptist in The Half That Has Never Been Told, arguing that the enslavement of African Americans and the enslavement of these Americans essentially jump-started the entire American economy. That these people harvested cotton, the cotton was then sold, the selling of the cotton helped fund the federal government. The federal government was then able to build roads and bridges and canals and harbors. And this basically created the momentum that created the modern American economy. This is a very controversial thesis. And Baptist's arguments have been very voraciously attacked by economists, by other historians who argue, no, slavery did not make America rich at all. And in fact, the counter argument goes that American slavery didn't really generate any wealth at all. What it did is it merely concentrated wealth. Instead of creating wealth for the whole nation, what slavery did, so the argument goes, was that it merely concentrated wealth in a small group of people, but at the same time created vast numbers of very, very poor people. And so the overall wealth of the country declined. But you wouldn't know that because you had these concentrated plantation owners. This is a major historical debate, and it has not been resolved as of the current year. It's still going on, and it gets quite ugly. The Economist had to retract a book review. It was pretty interesting. In the popular imagination, in the collective memory, most of what we know, most of what most people know about American slavery comes from television. And as a matter of fact, most of the popular conception of how slavery existed comes from a single television show. And that show was Roots in 1977. Roots was a truly groundbreaking television show. If you haven't seen it, it is an incredibly amazing show. It was incredibly popular in its day. And I was just a small kid when Roots came out, but still, I remember basically the entire country stopped for pretty much a month and a half and watched Roots and talked about Roots and talked about the cultural and social implications of this historical institution of slavery. And it's quite good. It holds up quite well today. I watched an episode when I was preparing this lecture. It does hold up right well. There's Geordie LaForge. Well, it's LeVar Burton, but he was the main character in the first few episodes. Kuta Kinte, about his enslavement in Africa and his transportation to the New World and his experience. And it Roots follows a single family, a single African-American family, from Kuta Kinte's capture in Africa through the generations up to emancipation in the 19th century. It's a really good show. Written by Alex Haley. But the thing is, the television show is based on a novel. And Alex Haley, the writer, was a novelist, and he wrote a novel. It was historical fiction. Alex Haley was, again, not a historian. But it doesn't matter, because Alex Haley's vision of American slavery is what entered the popular imagination, which is enslaved Africans growing cotton in the South. And that is what we think of now when we think of the historical situation of slavery. And this has created a number of myths in the collective memory about American slavery. And it makes discussion of the topic complicated, because you start talking about American slavery and everyone thinks Roots. All right. So you have to stop and actually talk about what happened to slavery in Americans' past. Because there were kind of three different stages of slavery. You have what went on in the 17th century. You have what went on in the 18th century. And then you have what went on in the 19th century. And it's the 19th century institution of slavery. African Americans, cotton, overseers, the South. That's what people think of as slavery. But it wasn't always like that. And the experience of Roots created a series of myths in the popular imagination, in the collective memory about slavery. And these myths are, well, they're right there. Things like, were the first slaves African? Was slavery unique to the American continent? Were all slaves African? And were all Africans in the Americans slaves? And the answer to all of those myths, all of these questions, is essentially no. Were the first slaves African? No, they were not. And indeed, who the first slaves in America were, as we shall see, strongly depends on your definition of the word slave. Was slavery unique to the American continent? No. Slavery has been practiced in all ancient civilizations for all time. The ancient Romans had slaves. The ancient Hebrews had slaves. The ancient Chinese had slaves. The ancient Egyptians had slaves. What's unique to the modern world and to the American continent was not slavery, but later emancipation. Were all slaves African? No. And in fact, in the early days, depending on what your definition of slavery is, you could argue that the first slaves in America were English or Irish or Native American. But again, it depends what you say when you say, slave. And were all Africans in the Americas slaves? Again, no. We know we have sailors in New Amsterdam from Africa who were never slaves. We know we have Africans arriving as immigrants who were not slaves. They're coming from Cuba. They're coming from Haiti. So not all slaves were African and not all Africans were slaves. But as we shall see, in the system that eventually develops, the vast majority of slaves were from Africa, and the vast majority of Africans in the United States have this legal condition. They are legal slaves when it's finally built in the 17th century. And all of this adds up to that question right up above me that you can see it. It's right up there. I can see it. And basically, this is the central question that we're going to tackle over the entirety of this lecture. And there it is. And I would strongly recommend writing this question down in your notes and keeping this question percolating through the back of your brain as we proceed through this lecture together. And the question is, why build the institution of American slavery? Where did it come from? Why is it so unusual in world history? Was slavery profitable? And why did some want to destroy it immediately? And finally, why did slavery persist after the American Revolution? And as we proceed through this lecture, and I say things or I present things that will be useful in building an answer to this question, mark them, write them down, and maybe put a little star next to them, because that's the question that you will eventually build an answer to. So let's set the stage. Jamestown is well established down in Virginia. You can see it right over there. That in the early 17th century, these English colonies sprout on the sort of jagged coastline of the eastern coast of North America. Plymouth up there eventually builds the foundation for what will be the New England colonies. Virginia in the Chesapeake Bay forms the foundation for what will be the Virginia and eventually Maryland colonies. And these are, for the most part, small little towns sort of scattered along the coast, with a series of growing cities mixed in among them: New York, Philadelphia, Boston. And these are small settlements. They're low. I mean, you can see right there, they're pretty much hugging the coast. To a large extent, they're not really penetrating very far inland, at least to some extent. They're hardscrabble farms. Down in Virginia, they are, of course, growing their one great cash commodity, tobacco. And in the north, they're growing subsistence crops, corn, wheat, potatoes, in the inlands. But in New England is largely turning to the ocean, fishing and whaling and trading. So we have these very early English colonies. We have people leaving Britain, leaving England, crossing the Atlantic Ocean, and arriving in the New World. And almost half come as indentured servants. So now we have to ask, well, what is an indenture? That right up above me, that is an indenture. An indenture is a contract in which one party agrees to work without pay for a set number of years on a farm or a plantation for little or no pay, generally no pay. And in return, they will receive passage to America, food and board, and then a rough agrarian education in the American colonies. So you have an individual, the second or third son of a farmer in England, and he's not going to inherit any land. So then he agrees, he makes an agreement with a plantation owner in Virginia that he's going to sign an indenture, and he's going to work for 5 years on the tobacco farm. And in return, he gets a ticket, he boards a ship, he crosses the ocean, he arrives at the plantation, And for the next 5 years, he's going to work on that plantation. And in return, he's going to receive food, shelter, clothing, and he's going to learn all there is to learn about tobacco. And that's how an indentured worked. That's how an indenture worked. It was farmers needing labor in America and laborers in England needing land. Most indentures were between 4 and 7 years, although there were some indentures, this was rare, that could go up to 9 years. And people would advertise for these things. Let's look at that advertisement over there. Wanted to go to the flourishing province of Maryland as indentured or redemption servants. 6 healthy men that understand farming and husbandry business. They're not misspelling anything. It was the style at the time to write your first S like in a big fancy, what looks like an F to us, but it's a big fancy S. So 6 healthy men who understand farming and husbandry business. They must be sober and accustomed to labor. So that is a plantation owner in Maryland. He wants 6 indentured servants working on his tobacco farm. So though one of those 6 guys are going to sign an indenture right up above me. They're going to agree to work for a number of years, generally 4 to 5, sometimes up to 9. And they come over as indentured servants. Now, indentured servitude is important because it is from indentured servitude that the Americans will build the institution of American slavery. Because indentured servitude has some of the same trappings. Okay, let's look at that newspaper classified ad right there. A servant's girl time to be disposed of, having about 2 and 4 months left to serve. Very fit for coarse work. So here is a servant girl in Philadelphia. She is an indentured servant, but you see, she still has 2.5 years left on her contract. But the person who owns her contract can't fulfill it. Probably they're broke or their farm has gone bankrupt. So he is going to sell her in the newspaper. And that's what he's doing right there. Indentured servants could be bought and sold. You could arrive thinking you're going to work on someone's farm, and they might run into a bit of problems or their farm might go bankrupt. And you might find yourself sold to a completely different farm. So indentured servants could be traded between plantation owners, between farm owners. Indeed, there's stories in early America of very drunk farmers betting, throwing indentures on tables and betting with them, playing intense games of poker or watching an intense horse race, throwing a couple indentures into the pot. And, you might expect to work at one farm for 4 years, and then 6 months after you arrive in America, your owner loses you in a poker match, and you find yourself working on another farm altogether. Now, there's another classified ad right over there. A Scotch servant's girl's time with almost 4 years left to serve. She has had the smallpox and is remarkably strong and healthy, fit for town or country business. Again, someone selling their indentured servant in the newspaper. And again, this is how indentures worked. You would sign away a period of your life, you would arrive in America, and then you would work on a tobacco farm or an indigo farm. And this did actually work, all right? You would arrive in the New World, you would work with no pay for a set number of years. But in that period, you would learn everything there is to know about tobacco farming, all right, which is a complicated process. It's not just putting plants in the ground and watering them occasionally. You have to grow them as small buds, and then you have to move the buds into the ground, and then you've got to wait until they get to a certain height. Then you've got to cut them, and then you've got to dry them. And tobacco is a complicated plant. It's a very labor-intensive plant. And it requires pretty specialized knowledge. So, if everything worked out, and if an indenture worked perfectly, this is basically how it would go. I would sign an indenture. I would work for 4 to 7 years on a tobacco farm. I would, of course, not be paid, but the person, my master, who owns my indenture, would give me food and clothing and shelter and a first-class education all about tobacco farming. And he wouldn't mistreat me, he wouldn't beat me, he wouldn't lose me in a poker match. And at the end of that period, I would get essentially a freedom day. I would get a little party, I would get a set of clothes, a set of tools, and in rare circumstances, a little bit of land. And then I basically go one river valley over, clear an area of the woods, and start planting tobacco. And if I work hard and luck favors me, I can turn a little 5-acre tobacco farm into a 15-acre tobacco farm, into a 50-acre tobacco farm, into an 80-acre, into a 120-acre tobacco farm. Now it's too much tobacco farm for me to farm. So I've got to get a couple indentured servants. That's ideally how it worked. In bad circumstances, it wouldn't work that way. Sometimes you had farmers who were not good people. They were not good farmers. They would beat or starve their indentured servants. Indentured servants had very limited rights. They could complain to the local magistrate, but for the most part, they couldn't leave the plantation without permission. They couldn't get married without permission. Women were not allowed to get pregnant. Getting pregnant would add a few years onto your indenture because you're pregnant and you can't work in the fields. And if you ran away or you were a bad worker, an owner could drag you into a judge and they could have more years added onto your indenture. But of course, there was a wide variety of different things that happened to different people. Now, the tobacco and indigo farmers of Virginia and Maryland get really, really dependent on indentured servitude. One of the problems is that in England, back in England, there's not enough land and too many people. But in America, it's the opposite problem. There's not enough people and too much land. And paid farm workers didn't want to work on somebody else's farm. I mean, there's plenty of land. So if you're a free person, why would you work on someone else's farm? You can just cut a farm of your own from the forest and start your own tobacco plantation. So these farmers and the entire tobacco and indigo business becomes highly dependent on this flow of indentured servants coming from England, this flow of cheap labor coming from the British Islands. Without a steady supply of indentured servants, most of those tobacco and indigo plantations couldn't pay workers enough. They couldn't pay them to stay, and the entire industry would collapse without indentured servants. And ultimately, this leads you to a question. And this is a question of which there is no exact one answer. And the question is indentured servitude a kind of slavery? Is it slavery? I mean, you have very limited rights. Someone purchases your time. You could be bartered between different plantation owners. And indeed, some indentured servants wouldn't even sign their indentures with plantation owners. Sometimes in England, you would sign an indenture with a ship captain, okay? So I am a very poor laborer in England or Liverpool or Manchester or wherever, and I want to get out of England. I go to a ship captain and I sign an indenture with him for 4, 5, 6, or 7 years. And obviously the ship captain is not going to use me for that period. They're going to sail to Virginia or Maryland, and then they're going to do just like what's happening above. They take these indentured servants, put them up on a stage, and sell their indentures at auction. And the ship captain is thinking that he's going to recoup the losses of the passage, the loss that moving this person across the Atlantic in auctioning them off. So indentured servants were sold at auction. So it's it has some of these trappings of slavery to it. Now, one of the chief arguments against this is, well, yeah, but these people were voluntarily entering into these contracts. And the answer is, were all indentures temporary? Were they all voluntary? And the answer to both of those questions is no. Not all indentures were voluntary, and not all of them were temporary. Sometimes you had these people who were given lifetime indentures. There's actually a major uprising in Ireland in the 17th century, and the English invade and crush the uprising. And all of these prisoners that they capture in this Irish rebellion, lifetime indentures. They shipped them off to America. Were all of these indentures voluntary? Did the people agree to this? Sort of, and no. I mean, if I'm a starving, impoverished farm laborer in England, that's not much of a call. You know, if my choices are starving to death on the streets of London or working for, you know, as an indentured servant in Virginia, that's not much of a choice. And those are people who even made the choice. Some people weren't even given that option. And this is the case of convicts, orphans, and foundlings. And none of these people were ever given the choice to become an indentured servant. If you look at these images, if you look at that one in the upper left, that thing is, that's a 17th century prison. And these things were called prison hulks. They didn't have big stone and steel prisons in the 17th century. They had those horrible things called hulks. All right, so what is a hulk? A hulk is a decommissioned warship. So Britain would have these big-bellied warships, and the ships would get old, and they wouldn't know what to do with them. So often they would just drag the ships up, and they would drag them into the low tide, and when the river would recede, these ships were left moored above on the riverine floodplain. They would take the masts and take the guns off, and then turn these boats into prisons. Subdivide the interior decks into cells. They would have 20 or 30 men in each cell. And if you were caught stealing or murder or any of the 1,000 crimes of 17th century England, you were given a spell in the prison hulks. Life in the prison hulks was brutal. It was short, it was wet, and it was cold. And you were not expected to live long in the prison hulks. And every now and again, the warden would appear down the hall of the prison hulk and say, okay, you now given a choice. You can do 4 years in a prison hulk, or you can sign an indenture for 7 years in Virginia. And a lot of those convicts took the indenture. And there you see a line of convicts shackled at the neck being taken from the prison hulks to ships bound for Virginia and Maryland. And it wasn't just convicts. It was also, and not all these guys were terribly guilty, by the way. And it wasn't just convicts. It was also little kids, orphans and foundlings. And if you look at that line of men chained at the neck, you'll notice there's 2 little kids in the middle of that line. There they are. This is basically what they did with orphans in the 17th century. Mom and dad died. Very sad. But the orphanage is full. Well, we need to get rid of these orphans. Hi, little Timmy. I know you're only 8, but would you like to go on an adventure to a magical land called Virginia? And they would. And some of the most heartbreaking historical documents you can find are indentures for 9, 12 years for people aged 8 and 9 years old, signing indentures and being sent off as an indentured servant to Virginia. In fact, there's actually a hospital orphanage in London, and they give the director of the hospital is given an award because he's managed to reduce the orphanage from about 260 children to 0. And he, in his speech, which has been preserved, In his speech, he says, it was divine providence and the land of Virginia that allowed me to do this. Because what he did is he simply took all of these 250 orphans in his orphanages and he sent them off as indentured servants. And there the little foundlings are on their way to Virginia. And they're going to learn all there is to learn about tobacco. And also, I want to point this out. Yes, a lot of indentures were for a set number of years. But if your indenture is for 5 years and you die on year 3, that was a lifetime indenture. And for the people who are wondering the difference between an orphan and a foundling. An orphan is a child whose parents have died, and a foundling is a child whose parents have abandoned them. So for the people who did agree to this, the people who weren't convicts or orphans or foundlings, the people who did agree to this, why would they do that? Why would you sign away 4, 6, 7 years of your life in a kind of slavery to learn all about tobacco farming? And primarily, there were 3 main reasons to do so. One is religion. You're the wrong religion in the wrong part of Britain. You are a Puritan in an area of Britain where there are not a lot of Puritans. You are an Anglican in an area where there's a lot of Puritans. You're a Catholic, and you Catholics are not welcome in that part of England. So you're going to come to the New World, you're going to sign an indenture or cross the ocean as a free person in order to practice your religion, to worship God in the way that you want. Also, the second reason is straight up poverty. Again, there's a lot of too many people in Britain and not enough land. And some people are not inheriting anything. And in addition, you have these legal acts called enclosure acts, in which a lot of very poor people living on public land or living on the king's land were forced out and forced into the cities. And basically, you were given the choice, sign an indenture to America or basically slowly starve in England. And a lot of people came because they were poor and they were desperate. And the third reason a lot of these people signed indentures, and the third reason they came to America, is England is not a safe place. And America, with all its dangers and diseases and Native Americans living in the woods, is still safer than what's going on in England. Because what's going on in England is the political tensions are rising, political violence is rising, religious violence is rising, and this will eventually erupt into a series of bloody civil wars. And from 1642 to 1651, you have the English Civil War, in which the entire government of England breaks into 2 factions: the Puritans and Parliament fighting the king and his cavaliers. And those are the 2 armies over there on the left. The top are the Puritan Roundheads, and at the bottom, the king and his cavaliers. And for 9 years, these 2 armies just clobber each other on the countryside, fighting between king and parliament. And a lot of people didn't want to have to make that call. They didn't want to get swept up in the violence. They didn't want to get pulled into one of these armies. And 5 years on a tobacco plantation in Virginia or Maryland, was better for some people than 9 years in an army, especially an army in one of these horrible conflicts. So the English Civil War lasts for 9 years, and it ends with a complete and total victory of the Puritan Parliament. Right up above me, Oliver Cromwell and his new model army conquers England. They crush the Cavaliers, they defeat the king, and then they execute him. King Charles I was decapitated, and Oliver Cromwell was established as the Lord Protector of England. And this led to something called Puritan England. It was a dictatorship. It was a Puritan dictatorship in which they attempted to create a theocracy in England. And they attempt to create the community of the elect in England. And again, a lot of people were just not into this. They didn't want to live in Puritan England. Or they were members of the king's army and they just wanted to get out. And so they're willing to sign indentures. England's a dangerous place. And a lot of people wanted to get out of it. But it wasn't a dangerous place forever. Oliver Cromwell dies in 1658. And Puritan England is a massive failure. People do not like Puritan England. Puritan England was puritanical. It was theocracy. They banned the theater. They banned public drinking. They banned dancing. They banned bear baiting. They made church mandatory. And people did not like it. And eventually, there is a movement against Puritan England. People want the Puritans gone. They want the Puritans out. And they don't do this while Oliver Cromwell is alive, because he would kill them or ship them off like he did the Irish, ship them all off to the Caribbean, ship a lot of them off to the Caribbean. So Cromwell dies in 1658, and within 2 years, Puritan England itself falls apart. And this leads to the restoration of the monarchy. And the restoration was the return of the king to England. The son of the executed king, he's right there, Charles II becomes king. And he's known as the Merry Monarch. He's kind of a good time Charlie. And King Charles II becomes one of the best kings in English history. He fixes a lot of the problems that England has. He is a very hands-off king. He doesn't challenge Parliament. He's more interested in the theater. He's interested in drinking. He's interested in hunting. He's interested in his many, many mistresses. He has got like 16 or 17 mistresses. He's good time Charlie. But in doing this, he's a very, very good king. And between King Charles II and between Parliament, they start fixing a lot of the problems that are in England. They start fixing problems in the cities. They start fixing problems in the countryside. Suddenly there are jobs for the people who don't have land. And there's land for the people who really want land. And this has a profound implication to what's going on in the American colonies. Because King Charles II is such a good king that there is fewer and fewer reasons to go to America. And there's even fewer and fewer reasons to sign an indenture. And this creates a collapse in immigration. And you can see the chart there on the left. These are the immigration levels from Britain to the American colonies. And you can see it just like goes right off of a cliff. Between 1660, the year of the Restoration, and 1680, immigration to the American colonies just collapses. It decreases by more than 90%. In the 1630s, in the 1640s, in the 1650s, you had dozens and thousands of people showing up, escaping horrible conditions in England. After 1660, after the Restoration, people don't want to risk everything in the American colonies. They're content to stay at home. And this creates a massive economic disruption in the American colonies. So there's a painting of an illustration of a tobacco farm right up above me. And I want you to ask yourself, why is this going to cause tremendous problems in the tobacco plantations of Virginia and Maryland? It's going to cause massive problems. Suddenly there is an intense competition for people. People get into bidding wars over indentured servants. Ship captains will put an indentured servant up for auction and prices will go sky high, higher than most plantation owners can afford. And the conditions of these indentures get very, very generous as labor grows more and more scarce. And as conditions in England improve, and as the level of immigration drops, and as the numbers of indentured servants dwindle, there is a major labor shortage in Virginia and Maryland, in these tobacco colonies. And the entire economic structure is now on the verge of collapse. They need to find a solution to this labor shortage. And they do. They find it in Africa. And again, we are opening up this question. Why build the institution of American slavery? Where did it come from? Why is it so unusual in world history? Was slavery profitable? Why did some want to destroy it? And why did slavery persist after the Revolution? You don't have all the information to answer this question just yet, but you've got a lot of it. And that's what we'll deal with in the next lecture, and I will see you there.